Welcome to Personalist Manifestos. My name is Michael Morelli, and I'm the host. In this week's conversation, I speak with a childhood friend by the name of Jeff Wheeldon. As you'll hear, initially Jeff thought he was going to be a pastor, and then he thought he was going to be a theology professor, but then he ended up in politics. Now, some of you may be excited to hear that I'm interviewing a Christian who happens to be in politics, but some of you might get a little skittish. If you're in the latter category, just stick with us. I think you'll find that Jeff is breaking the mold in terms of what it means to be a Christian in politics. And just a heads up before we jump into the conversation with Jeff, it's the summer, so I'm going to be away here and there. So that means I may not be posting as much, but I'll try to still be present as much as I can while also getting some much needed rest. Speaking of which, make sure you're getting some rest too. Don't always be busy doing stuff. You need time to just be. And so with that, here's my conversation with Jeff. All right, Jeff Wheeldon, welcome to Personalist Manifestos. How's it going today?
Thank you, Michael. Dr. Morelli, it's going very well. I tend to be somebody who I don't care very much about my own titles, but I like to honor and respect yours. The last time I saw you, I jumped right into uh, nicknames from childhood. And so I want to say, Dr. Morelli, appreciate you, and I'm glad to be here.
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, let's get that out in the open right from the get-go that Jeff and I go way back. How far back do we go?
Well, I probably met you when I would have been 10.
Right, right.
Probably I was in grade 4 or 5 when I started hanging out with your older brother Pete,
Yeah,
and my house was where every kid in the neighborhood played kick the can.
yep,
So I probably would have met you running through the darkness in my backyard somewhere.
yes. As a gangly 8-year-old, because
Yeah.
there's a 2-year difference or so. And nicknames from back then. What was my nickname?
Well, you were Mikey
Yeah,
E. Morelli, and your mom called you Mikey. Now I
it's
am not
true.
your mom, so I don't claim the right to this, but that was. I just remember that was how I was first introduced to you. It was
Yeah,
probably your mom hollering somewhere, Mikey.
yeah. Probably. Yeah. Well, you can call me Mikey. I honestly, I actually feel really awkward about the formal title thing.
Me
Like
too.
I actually, I think it's very Canadian of us that like we just generally assume that if someone demands that they're referred to with their formal title, that that they kind of are self-promoters. And if you're a self-promoter to a Canadian, like be very suspicious because they're really good people, the people that are really good at what they do, they don't promote.
Hmm.
Their portfolio speaks for itself. So
Yeah.
that's why it was just like we have to disavow any hint of self-promotion. So I just make that quick move to be like, no, 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 call me Michael.
Yeah.
I'm just a person like you. I put my pants on one leg at a time.
Well, and so my kids introduce me to people as Councillor Wheeldon. And so we'll
That's
get that
awesome.
out of the way. I'm a municipal councillor in Brighton, Ontario.
Yeah.
And I'm always quick to jump in as well and say, "Hi, I'm Jeff."
Yeah.
You can call
Yeah.
me
Yeah.
Jeff.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that I am, I mean, I'm sure that I have some kind of psychological thing where I'm allergic to my own success or status or anything else like that. But also, I do really believe that the most respectful way I can engage with someone is to try and speak their name, to engage with who they are, not what they are. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
you ask, I've been listening to your whole back catalog on this podcast, and
Oh, thank you.
who am I? And I always think, so who am I really? This is the biggest question you could ask, and it's right out of the gate. So,
Yeah. We don't
uh,
mess around here.
so I was thinking about, I could list the things that I do.
Hmm.
But really, I want to say the things that I love, the first and foremost. I am a father of two wonderful children, a beautiful wife, Andrea. I love systems and problems. And so I always view the world through systems. And I love solving problems. I love meeting people where they're at in those problems and working with them. Um, and I am increasingly learning to love myself and value my own enjoyment of life. And so I told you earlier, I've started writing a novel. I paint Warhammer minis. I play D&D. I nerd out with my friends, and am increasingly learning to see that as the best use of my time. And just the idea of having leisure. And I might rant about that later, but
Mm,
the idea of being able to direct my own time and energy into something that is life-giving. So that's really what I've oriented myself around, and sort of built up a sense of identity, because I kind of lost all of my other senses of identity.
mm,
I used to have a really strong sense of identity that was rooted in where I was from, but then I kept moving. And then I had a strong sense of identity that was rooted in going to church. And I don't do that anymore, I'll be honest with you. Um, and then I had a strong sense of identity that was rooted in my political affiliations. And that was ultimately impossible as a source of self-concept.
mm,
And all political parties are deeply flawed. And so it was difficult to have that. And as each of these things in my life kind of pulled away for a period there, I had no idea who I was.
mm.
Even academia, I started on the academic path and then never finished it, and so all of these different ideas of who I am or what I do have just changed over time, and I've had to just find something deeper in myself, which is, I think, what I love,
Mm.
to say as a way of saying who I am.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I love that response to, yeah, big question, who is Jeff? And I one of the things that I just remember about you, and I think probably why you and I have always got on well, even though you were you know friends in class with my older brother, is just that I think you're a seeker. And you
Mm,
always had the good albums, you always had the good video games, and let's be honest, we're both nerds. So I do
yeah.
want to ask more serious questions, but I do want to really, this is a question I always ask people when I find out that they play D&D is what is your go-to class?
Every single time I create a new character, and I create 10 times as many characters as I ever have a chance to play, but
Okay.
especially when I know that I'm going to play them, I have to talk myself out of always choosing Paladin, Redemption Paladin. I feel like
Hmm.
there's no more Jesus-y class than the Redemption Paladin. Um, and if not Redemption Paladin, then I default to Bard.
Okay. Yeah, I just think that the class that someone like the first impulse choice tells you a lot about the personality, right?
Yeah.
And that makes total sense, right? You have a sense of justice, which is informed by your faith and your convictions. Um, but yeah, you also have a bit of that storyteller in you that I think the bard element would fit in. Yeah, I always go Wood Elf Ranger.
Mhm.
So I'm a bit of a rogue. Like there's a bit of a rogue in there, but there's a little bit more of a sense of like connection to the natural environment. A bit of a lone wolf, stealthy, but like a bit of a sort of chaotic moral code. You
Mhm.
know, um, yeah, it's just always worked for me. It's
Yeah.
always worked for me. Yeah. So, this is why I wanted to talk to you on the show because, you know, beyond just like, hey, look at us now, who would have thought? But you
Yeah.
just like y people formally refer to you as Councillor Wheeldon. You're in politics. You identify as a Christian, correct?
I do. Yeah.
Yes. So,
I do it with lots of caveats these days, but I do.
exactly. So all of those things make you a very interesting and unique figure. Like, how does one end up in politics in the way that you have doing politics in the way that you do it. So before we get into what you're currently doing and the features of it and how your sort of your theology and philosophy informs that, I'm just interested in the origin story of how you got into politics. And you did think about ministry for a while, and then you thought about the academic theology thing for a while. And I remember you saying, like, when I asked you to come on the show, you're like, yeah, and let's talk about why I chose to become a politician instead of a pastor. So
Yeah,
so tell us your origin story, like how you arrived at that point, that crossroads, and you're like, I'm going into politics.
sure. Well, I mean, I think it largely um, it's a story about trying to find ways to continue following Jesus. I was a Christian teen, was baptized in an Alliance church. I know you're an Alliance guy. Vernon Alliance was the place to be at the
Mm.
time.
It was, yeah.
Um, but I had a bit of an ecstatic experience, what some would call a deliverance experience when I was in my late teens. And I was trying to figure out what that meant. But it was a conversion experience. And so I did start hanging out with church kids again. And I mean, at this point, I was 18 years old, and so church kids was young adults. And the cool young adults group at the time was at the Pentecostal church. And I just had this ecstatic experience. And so the Pentecostals was a good place to be. And I ended up going to Bible college, Summit Pacific College. I know you're at Trinity Western. Summit
Hmm.
is also affiliated with Trinity Western, so I'm
Yeah.
technically a Trinity alum. Um, but I was trying to figure out what had happened to me. I'd had this very spiritual experience, and so I was immediately hooked by Bible courses and theology courses, and just dove into that. Um, really love the Bible, but immediately upon like learning to read the text more critically and things like that, realized that like I started my deconstruction basically in second year Bible college,
Mm.
because I was like, wow, why don't they teach this stuff in church?
Hmm.
Started unlearning a lot of the theology that I absorbed through my high school years and things like that. Um, and so I was more and more interested in scripture and theology, and more appalled at what I was seeing in churches. When I started my first church internship, my pastors, I was expecting, great mentorship of the kind that I was getting in Bible college from these pastors. And we would have a staff meeting over lunch where we all go out for lunch together on the church uh, card, and they were talking about rims and golf and
Hmm.
like their trucks. And one morning, I found a kid sleeping in the church bus, a youth who had nowhere to sleep. And so I was so excited to show him, we've got all of these people in this church who are going to, we're going to help you. We want to support you. And I brought him into the church with the hope of finding resources for him there, expecting to offer him resources there. And we ran into an old pastor, and all he said was, "What kind of drugs are you on?" And then he made sure that he said in front of this youth, make sure you lock up that bus so that no one else can get in there. And that was it. That was all our church offered. And so here I am, about to enter into my third year of Bible college thinking, my God, where are you here? Like, so I was kind of radicalized. And so because I went to Bible college thinking that I was following Jesus, and then not finding him in churches. Um, so fast forward a little bit, graduated Bible college, got married, lived in Toronto for a year, and spent a lot of time hanging out with people who were experiencing homelessness in Toronto. Interned at a church there that was an amazing church that was beautiful and creative and responsive to the community. And shout out to Free Church Toronto. Great experience there. Um, but then went off to seminary, and we were at Providence. theological seminary. My wife Andrea was resident director, so we lived in the girls' dorm. Got to live on campus, extend my campus experience, um, and was hanging out in the cafeteria every day with undergrads actually, like Dan Rempel and Ryan Turnbull. I know you've had
Wow.
both of them on your show.
Awesome.
But yeah, I had a great seminary experience. And again, going deeper this time in a non-denominational context where, I'm surrounded by Mennonites, but they've never heard of Anabaptists.
Hmm.
And so absorbing a lot of Anabaptist theology, but really being aware that like in the actual churches outside the walls of the seminary, these people have in many ways lost connection to their theological roots.
Hmm.
There was an American evangelical revival in the 50s in that area, and all of the Mennonites converted to evangelicalism. Um, and so the richness of that Anabaptist theology was largely lost in the area. Um, and at the same time being taught by Anglicans, who some of them were former Pentecostals who had moved on from Pentecostalism. It's so common they call it the Canterbury Trail.
Yeah.
Um, and so again, trying to find ways to engage with the richness and depth of theological rigor and ethical rigor that I was finding in academia in a world where that was not only foreign, but it was threatening. So trying to engage with churches at that level just wasn't working. And I thought, gosh, if I were to have a pastoral position, I wouldn't last long. And that has borne out. I look at my friends who did go on into ministry, and most of them are not there anymore. And some of them got some pretty big scars along the way.
Hmm.
At the same time, I started working in the registrar's office there, and I had been thinking, yeah, I really want to go down the further education route. I want to get a PhD. I want to teach theology. I want to keep this campus experience going forever. Um, but as a registrar, I was looking at the numbers and realizing, okay, Prov is a median level size school of all of the ATS or Association of Theological Schools. Prov is right in the middle in terms of size, and we had one theology prof. There's 500 schools, and you think, okay, so most schools, the majority of schools have one, maybe two theology profs and graduate three, maybe four doctoral students every year. Simply, I didn't have to write down the math to figure out that there was not going to necessarily be a place for me if I were teaching.
Hmm.
And then I had a kid, and that changed everything. So they kind of took that off the table.
Yeah, kids will do that to you, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But while I was doing that, I was also looking at the business model of academia and realizing how, not just that the a lot of the ivory tower stuff about academics is true, and that we can be happily debating the tiniest bit of knowledge or doctrine while the world burns around us. Um, but also looking at the business model and realizing that uh, this is not sustainable and that schools are more and more in trouble, financially speaking. And so it wasn't necessarily a safe place for me to land, even if I could land there.
Yeah.
Looking at how many profs are living precariously because they're sessional instructors at two or three institutions and driving 2 hours each way just to teach a class for, a couple $1,000 a semester. Um, and I thought, man, it seems like every time I hitch myself to some institution to try and ground myself and build a future on that, it turns out that's not a good plan. But that at the same time, I was getting more and more involved in politics because I thought, if I want to actually live like Jesus, if I want to embody Christ in the world and do my part in a democratic society to embody justice in this world, that happens by engaging with people and problems. And that all happens in politics. Politics is the sort of hub of all of those things, is where we can actually solve problems together, right?
Hmm.
Except that it's not really, but it took me a while to figure that out. So I started a Green Party of Canada riding association in 2012. I ran a campaign for a candidate in a by-election in 2013. or 2014 maybe. And then I ran myself federally in 2015, and this is in a riding called Provencher, which was Louis Riel's riding.
Hmm.
Learned a lot about Louis Riel there. But that is what sometimes people will call a yellow dog riding, which is to say you could run a yellow dog, and as long as it was in the right party, it would win.
Hmm.
I don't know why they say yellow, but that's what they call it. So it's a very, very blue riding. It's fascinating to see how the German Mennonite towns all vote overwhelmingly conservative, while the French Catholic towns next to them all vote overwhelmingly liberal.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so I was involved with the Green Party. I learned a lot about politics and how that system works. Even as I was writing my master's thesis on powers and principalities
Hmm.
and learning about how systems work from a theological perspective, but also from a just system dynamics are the same, whether it's a theological, conceptual system like a theological system or an economy or an ecosystem. The dynamics are similar no matter what kind of system it is. So that was a huge education, and I would say that my theological studies opened me up to politics and sociology and just understanding the world around me so much better. So I'm forever grateful for that.
Yeah. I want to go back to the piece about um I mean, this is a language I would use, but what I hear from you saying like not having roots to one's own history, I think you're totally right. I think one of the things with evangelicalism, it's its superpower, but its ability to like unhitch from tradition
Hmm.
and invent itself and reinvent itself anew.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I think there are core elements of like we still, or it's still locked within that model of like bigger is better, personality driven, right? The affect as the thing that you want to really stir up in order to get responses, conversions, commitments, and so on. But the shadow side of that is an ahistoricism that results in a lack of identity, which leads to, I think, some of the problems that we're talking about within the local church, but also within the political sphere. Like I'm just triangulating those things because I was just doing a directed study with some students on narrative theology, right? And the primary narratives of our time, and then of course the counter narrative that we get in scripture and in just like the history of the church, and part of the sort of constructive conclusion of that was just to say, in order to guard against just how pervasive and powerful the narratives of our times are, we actually need to know our story so
Yeah.
that when we see something that is not in line with it, we're like, this is not who we are.
Yeah.
But if you don't have roots in traditions, which are there to remind you of the story and the key plot lines and the
Yeah.
primary characters and the secondary characters, then you're in trouble. And I just hear in what you're saying, like if we're wondering why we are where we are and people are voting for the people that they are and doing the things that they're doing, you're like, there it is. Like, not that tradition is the solution to everything, but I do think it's a helpful, it gives you a helpful sense of identity that
Yeah.
helps you figure out like, is this who we are? Is this really who we are? Like, should we really be the type of person that the first impulse when there's a youth that's fallen asleep in this bus, it's like, what drugs you on, and we better lock that bus?
Yeah.
Because last time I checked, that's not the script that we've received, neither
Yeah.
from scripture or
Not
from
to,
like the core parts of who we are.
and not to pin all of this on evangelicalism.
No, 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 not at all.
Sociologists will talk about the McDonaldization of culture
Right.
and talk about the global hegemony, cultural hegemony of America, or they'll tag this onto capitalism or things like that. Empire comes to mind, a great book about the McDonaldization of the world and the American cultural hegemony. But it's not just capitalism. It's not just evangelicalism. There is a homogenization that happens as culture spreads and cultures engage. And the things that capitalism and evangelicalism have tapped into just happen to be things that spread easily. It is a promise of something that is worth giving up what you're currently holding in order to grab at. And when we give up what we're currently holding in order to grab at that thing, whether it's an evangelical notion of salvation or whether it's a capitalist notion of success or sufficiency or whatever it is that we're trying to grab at, we end up losing what we have in our hands. And it turns out what we're grabbing at is the same thing everybody else is grabbing at. And it's pablum, it's weak, it's
Mm-hmm.
bland because it's generic. And we
Mm-hmm.
lose all of the value of our difference.
Yeah. And I think this fits into the principalities and powers discussion and institutions discussion. It's like, if that's what we're reaching for, we don't have a lot of resources to spot the principalities and powers at play and just how broad and deep they go and how they're directing us and forming us. And so what thinkers were helpful in that work that you did? Because I do want to get to, you know, your politics, but I know you well enough to know that it like that type of reading that you're doing on principalities and powers, or I know that you are a reader of Bonhoeffer, and I remember your blog. I don't know if you're still doing it, but stumbling through Bonhoeffer, like these are the sorts of theologians and ways of thinking that like you are drawn to, and I know that that works its way into what you're doing as somebody in politics. So can you share a little bit of that sort of thought system behind, who you are and what you're doing, like vocationally speaking?
Sure. Well, I was thinking about this, and it turns out that all of my favorite theologians are multidisciplinary. Bonhoeffer's first thesis was a sociology of the church. Um, I, uh, I'll be honest, haven't read deeply in Ellul, and I've always wanted to because whatever else I was reading, Ellul was in the footnotes. He was always there. I've read The Judgment of Jonah. I've read essays and snippets on technology, but I've always wanted to do more digging. And to the point where when I was looking for a second reader on my thesis on powers and principalities, I actually asked Marva Dawn, who is best known as an interpreter of Jacques Ellul.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, she was already losing her eyesight at that point, and so she said she was unable to do it, but she was
Yeah.
lovely to talk to.
Oh, just to interject here. First of all, I mean, Elul wrote so much, and this actually kind of explains what myself and other Elul scholars are trying to do is do a lot of that heavy lifting in terms of reading the work, interpreting it, and just relaying it to other people to say, you may not have the time to read 60 plus books and the 1,000 plus articles that he wrote while alive. And, there's more unpublished material coming out. Like he was so prolific. I remember my supervisor saying to myself and my friend Jake, who's also an Elul scholar, you're doing all the reading for those of us who just don't have time to do all of it, and telling us, hey, if you're into the politics, you might want to go here for a little. If you're into like the stuff on myth, go here. If you want the biblical commentaries, go here. Technique, technology, go here, right? And so and even this podcast is a way of just like sharing the various strains of a very prolific interdisciplinary thinker that I think is ready made for our times. Because, as I often say, I'm with you. I'm drawn to interdisciplinary thinkers because the questions, the challenges, the opportunities that we're confronted with today are not navigated well by any one discipline. Like we
Yeah.
need all the resources at our disposal to take on some of these yes, social questions, economic questions, cultural questions, what have you, political questions. But if we're just relying on one discipline in order to navigate any of those spheres and the questions being presented, We just don't have the resources.
Yeah.
And so it's in that interdisciplinary, integrated way of thinking and living that, oh, big surprise, that's human life. Human life is integrated and interdisciplinary. So we need the
Completely.
thought, the thought systems in order to be able to live into that reality.
Mhm. And that's what
But
I
yeah,
found. Like
yeah,
whenever I see one of these theologians who's also a sociologist
yeah,
or something else, um, I see much more relation to the practical in them because
mhm,
they're just being embedded in more than one perspective there. They're actually looking at a broader picture of life. It's
yeah,
very easy to get purely theoretical when we're talking theology.
yeah,
And that was one of the things that so I focused my thesis on the work of Walter Wink,
right.
writing about powers and principalities. And the more I learned about systems through that work, because he examines systemic evil as opposed to personal evil, and I compared and contrasted him with Greg Boyd's work on evil to try and say, is evil personal or is it systemic or is it both? And the more I learned about systems from Wink, the more I saw them in the world around me. And the more I realized that also the conceptual systems, theological systems, like systematic theologies that we construct, can be vast and complex and coherent and just not quite connected to reality. You can create a system where all of the pieces fit, but then you realize that it's looking out a different window. It's,
Yeah, there's a line by the theological ethicist Michael Banner. It's in his book Ethics of Everyday Life,
yeah,
and he basically says a version of what you says, and he's like, "Don't get me wrong, love, formulation of doctrine and elegant systems, but he's like, if that's where we begin and end, he's like, that's the equivalent of a beautiful, I'm paraphrasing here, a beautiful trumpet solo played in space."
right.
Nobody hears it. It's
Yeah.
just right. It's beautiful, but it's like, does it actually like hit the ground? Does it grow legs? Does it move around?
And all disciplines do this too, right? Like you look at behavioral economics,
Hmm.
really upset the entire economics community because they dared to ask, but do people really behave the way that they do in our models? Do real
Mm.
humans behave this way? Turns out, no, not at all. And if you listen, I listen to free economics radio all the time. I'm always
Yeah.
hearing economists talking, and I'm always like, have you met people?
No, they're just looking at graphs and models.
Well, largely, yes, and that's
I'm just kidding. I
it's
wouldn't have no idea, but
but
uh,
no, I mean that's the critique from within their own community at this point is, oh, we've realized that this is why behavioral economics was such a big deal with Richard Thaler and others who were looking at how do people actually behave and bringing more psychology into economics. Because the model of Homo economicus assumes that human beings make purely rational and self-interested choices.
mhm.
The reality is that we're very rarely rational. Self-interested, self-interest as a concept doesn't really work most of the time. And our behavior is guided by so many other things that economic models don't take into account. And so, doing the same thing with theology, but also the same thing with political science. We have so many systems, and we idolize democracy until it doesn't work. And the reality is that the democratic systems that we exist within today were created in a different era when they applied to different people and very, very, very different problems at much smaller scales. And the thing about systems, I mentioned earlier about system behavior being the same, whether it's an ecosystem or an economic system or whatever, system behavior is more or less the same. Where it changes is at different levels of scale. And what we're seeing right now across the world is that our systems are scaling up. Everything is global now. And all of the news we pay attention to is global. We all have a global mindset, except that all of our systems were designed for small towns, not
Mm.
globes. And so I am increasingly focused on localism, hyper localism. How can I make these systems work? I think the only place that they can work is in a neighborhood, maybe a small town. And so, how do we redesign our systems so that we can maintain that connection? And this is where I had never read anything by Lowell on personalism, but the more I listen to your podcast, I'm like, oh, this is what personalism is. Yes, I am 100% a personalist. And the only scale you can truly be personalist at and respecting human persons as persons
Yeah.
is in some very small groups.
Yeah.
But if we don't have systems that respect persons in that way, we will not have just systems. So how do you take that personalism and scale it up even to the size of a small town? Brighton's got 12, 13,000 residents. Is it possible for me to really be a personalist with 13,000 people? Not meaningfully, but I can do it with every single one I come in contact with.
Yeah.
And if I lived in Toronto and I had 95,000 people in my riding, there's no way that I could.
Yeah.
So, yeah, these are the kinds of things that these theological reflections have spurred in me in terms of our political systems and the way that we live our lives together. But it really did start with Bonhoeffer, Walter Wink, Jacques Ellul. When I was researching evil, I kept coming across René Girard.
Hmm.
Absolutely, love his work on scapegoating.
Yeah.
And those are the sort of the main thinkers that have guided my ethical formation. And then from there, I've just sort of spun off into other disciplines that talk about the same things, that talk about human behavior, that talk about systems. So really got into systems thinking. Donella Meadows is the author of the best book on systems thinking. If you look up systems thinking, that everyone's going to say, well, just read Meadows and go from there. But she was working with the Club of Rome in the 70s that wrote the Limits to
Right.
Growth.
Yeah.
Um, I was really influenced by Schumacher.
Hmm.
Oh, why can't I think of the name of his
Small
book?
is beautiful.
All is Beautiful.
Yeah.
Broke my heart and got me into the Green Party,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
which actually started out as the Small Party when it was first founded in Canada, the Green Party of Canada. Before that, it was called the Small Party. Elizabeth May was one of the founders, and it was based on Small is Beautiful.
Wow. I didn't know that. I
Yeah.
should know that, but I love that. That's a great name. Yeah. So first, I want to go all the way back to Marva Dawn because I just need
Yeah,
to say I need to go on record actually saying that she's one of my favorite readers of Elul. Uh,
I've heard
she,
that.
yeah, her PhD thesis on powers and principalities in Elul's work is so good, and I think she repurposed some of that material for her book Powers, Weakness, and the Tabernacling of God.
Mm.
But like only I think only parts of that PhD thesis made its way into the book. And I'm like, that that thesis should just be published like wholesale because it's so good. But I think, what you're saying is wholly in line with personalism. I mean, Alul was in dialogue with Girard, and actually he was interested in the Club of Rome. He writes about it actually in his book that was published after his death. He didn't finish it completely, but Theology and Technique.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I feel like you're just kind of all the things that you're saying, and I think you're right about the bigger you get, the harder it is to practice personalism because the bigger you get, the more likely you are to depersonalize. And so
Yes.
this is part of this vision of the personalists, and there's different expressions of it, but this idea of thinking globally, acting locally, and it's this is where the anarcho-syndicalism comes into play. This sort of socialist idea of there's localized groups of people who collaborate together, like socially, politically, and so forth, but they're also interacting with other groups in other localities in
Yeah.
order to scale. But you never sort of lose that localized connection with your group, while also being mindful of like your neighbor and your neighbor's neighbor and so on and so on. And over time that starts to scale. That's at least the idea.
Mhm.
But even just as a theoretical concept. I'm like, that is compelling, and yet it says a lot that like you're in local municipal politics, right? And I just say it says a lot that the turnout for voting is lowest at municipal, and then like the next highest, right, is like provincial, and then the highest always is federal.
Yeah.
And what if we actually experienced or precipitated an inversion of that, or maybe the turnouts were equal, right? But the role that the media plays of like, it's the federal that gets the most attention, but you're like, a lot of the decisions are made very practically more at the municipal level, right?
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of bait and switch, unfortunately. But how do we relocalize
Yeah.
politics?
And that's a huge thing that you've touched on there because our attention, even like beyond our attention to our own federal politics, we pay more attention to American federal politics than we do to our own.
Yeah.
We're always looking for, the news is about what's happening in Ukraine or in Gaza, not about what's happening down the street. Um, and there's so much to unpack about why that is, but the effect that it has on us is a kind of it erodes our rootedness, and there's a kind of disintegration of community. We know more about Vladimir Putin than we do about our own neighbor. Um, and so, how do we form a functional community that's capable of care? Right now, I am chairing a task force, the Brighton Homelessness Task Force. And our mayor suggested that we form this task force because we are aware of one person who's living rough in Brighton.
Hmm.
And he's visible, he's downtown, nice enough guy, but he might be asleep on the stage in the middle of Memorial Park, or he might be walking around with a shopping cart full of his belongings. Um, we don't have a shelter in Brighton. We don't have any other services. All of our services are located in Coburg, which is half an hour to the west. It is the county seat. It's where the only shelter for our entire county is located. And they have full wraparound supports there and all sorts of great services, but they come out to Brighton when there's need in Brighton rather than having a constant presence here. And so we formed this task force that involved people from churches, people from the food bank, the volunteers from the social network that keeps our community going. All the unspoken unsung heroes. And so all of those groups have delegated or someone to come to this task force, and we talk about how can we build a social network within Brighton that uh, even though there are social services that are officially mandated, how do we make sure that there are no gaps? How do we make sure that we are a welcoming community where even if there wasn't a shelter in Coburg, because right now there's questions about whether or not there will be a shelter in Coburg, because in Coburg they're trying very hard to shut it down
Right.
because they don't want to deal with this problem anymore. And so we're saying, well, what if there isn't a shelter in Coburg? What will happen to our residents who need that support?
Because you're dealing with NIMBYs, not in my backyard folks, right? Is
Yes,
that
and,
is that
and
why there's always resistance to it?
yeah, and I mean, people have legitimate concerns, and no one should ever feel afraid in their own community. And visible homelessness often comes with seeing people in terrible conditions, seeing people who are dirty and smelly and maybe not fully sane, having the worst day of their life every day of their life. It is upsetting, naturally. And then you see them sometimes fighting, you see them sometimes doing drugs in the open. It's upsetting to children, it's upsetting to adults. It feels unsafe for people. And I hear that. And I try and sit with the people who are experiencing that discomfort. But the reality is, if you shut down a shelter, those people are not just going to disappear. You're going to see them even more because the less time they're in the shelter, the more time they're in your vision.
Hmm.
So, but there is a dominant idea among some groups who happen to be loud that if you just get rid of these services, then people will go somewhere else. There's a lot of discussion about how do we even know these people are from here? A lot of the language and rhetoric about people who, in many cases, maybe most cases, actually grew up in that community, that that they're from somewhere else. We don't owe them anything. They are coming in here to get access to our services. It's the same kind of rhetoric you hear from Trump about illegal immigration, except it's small town Canada talking about people who have nothing.
Hmm.
Um, and so, trying to push back against that in a way that is still able to hear people's concerns, because those concerns, you feel what you feel. Your concerns are real.
Yeah.
Uh, and and yet to be able to say, I want to, rather than just telling you that I'm going to do what you've asked me to do, I'm going to sit with you in this discomfort long enough for you to know that you are heard and cared for. And then I need to exercise enough moral courage to chart a path through this problem rather than running away from it or trying to push it out of the picture.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's harder than populism. And so there are plenty of populists out there who are happy to say, "Oh
Yeah.
yeah, we'll take care of this. I can fix it. We're going to get rid of this. I hear you. You're having a hard time seeing that homeless person. Let's get him out of here."
Hmm.
So, looking at that, understanding how that works, and putting that into the context of systems of powers and principalities, being able to put a moral angle on it without having to moralize at people, and just be able to say, you know what, this is how systems have always worked. They're not necessarily going to follow the rules of what we think that system was supposed to be there for. We often forget, or we often think that the system functions the way that we intend it. And I often hear people tell you, oh no, the system isn't broken. It's functioning exactly the way it was intended. And we always want to put intention on it because we think this is evil. Evil is bad intentions. And the reality is, systemic evil has no intention behind it. It is mindless. It
It's
may or may
ambivalent.
not be personal, but flesh and blood is not our enemy here.
Mm.
Powers and principalities have no intention. They function, the system functions the way that it functions, and we need to judge it based on the way this functions rather than what we think someone intended. Most
Yeah.
systems were built over generations by a whole bunch of unrelated people who each made a little tweak here and a little tweak there. Um, you look at something like democracy, it was designed for a handful of elites who were the only landowners who were considered citizens. And they would basically draw straws to say, oh, looks like uh, Michael's in charge this week and Jeff will be in charge next week.
Mm.
Uh, and it was about that group of elites administering their own interests, and everyone else fell under them. The idea of opening up that franchise to millions of people who are, almost entirely unconnected, disconnected from each other, um, it breaks down at that scale. It doesn't always work. And the kinds of questions that we're asking now of democracy. I heard on Homebrewed a great discussion one time about how um, the level of complexity of the issues that we're addressing in democracy now are completely untenable to ask of regular people. We're talking about whether or not we should regulate AI and how, as if anybody understands that. We're talking about the long-term impacts of nuclear weapons and nuclear reactors. We're talking about climate change and the thresholds 100 years into the future that will be determined by what we choose today.
Hmm.
Those are things that have longer horizons than we are capable of really thinking clearly about, and levels of complexity that most people can't engage with. And then we say, and this is what we're going to campaign on. These are the things that the problems we need to solve together. So let's vote about it. Nonsense.
Hmm.
How
Hmm.
could we ever get a good answer out of that? And yet, that's the only way that we feel like we have any agency in our society. And our society is based on the principle that we all have agency here because that's the promise of democracy. And when we feel like we don't have real agency, then we feel like this isn't my country anymore. And so we feel insecure and we feel upset. And then we storm the Capitol.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true everywhere. I've been listening a lot lately to well, podcast as always, but Astra Taylor's 2023 Massey lectures.
Right.
We recommend everyone check them out. Put them in the notes if
Yeah,
you
I
can.
bet I will do.
Um, her lectures were called The Age of Insecurity. And she talks about insecurity in terms of almost a requirement of capitalism,
Hmm.
but just this idea that um, we are pushed to feel insecure at all times. Um, as far as labor security, the labor markets are bad, considered to be bad when people feel like they have agency in terms of their labor. And as long as labor is scarce, it can be controlled, and that's good for business, which is good for the markets. And so she looked at CERB, the payments that came out during COVID,
Right.
and how as soon as possible they got rid of CERB because it was bad for the labor market, which is to say it was bad for employers because people felt like they could actually quit their jobs for a while there.
Yeah.
And did very quickly. Or you look at she looks into the history of the commons as this idea of like we all have a right to access the land, and how the system of enclosure, which was the eradication of the commons, really said no, all land must be owned and controlled in order for it to be productive. And that became the basis of capitalism. And it's like, oh, so we all have to live in this kind of enforced precarity just to make sure that our economic system works. And so no wonder we feel insecure. And
Yeah.
I've been digging into technology, and this is where a little maybe is valuable as well. But I've been doing it through Cory Doctorow,
Yep. Yeah.
who
Yeah.
talks about the enshittification of everything.
Yeah.
Uh, we are increasingly dependent on mobile apps and online technologies for everything. I hear from my dad every week about how he can't log into his bank account, and he has to spend 2 hours on the phone with somebody just to figure out something that he used to be able to walk into a branch and do.
Hmm.
And the reality is that it is harder than it should be. I don't like logging into my bank either. Why doesn't this system work? You know, we are innovating faster than ever, and yet the things that we rely on day to day sucks. And so, if we feel like the systems we depend on are not accessible to us, and that when we do access them by doing something like, uh, voting to access our democratic system, and then it turns out that we're just one vote among millions, and we don't really know what the issues are because you need a PhD or three to really understand it, um, then how can we not feel insecure? And at the same time, emotional intelligence is so incredibly rare. The ability to feel what you feel and then actually do a little bit of interrogation of your own feelings and be able to say, I'm feeling this because of this. I spent a lot of years in therapy, and I've developed a little bit of these skills, and I've studied them, and I've even developed a course on them at one point. And so I know how critical it has been for making my own life livable and helping me to find my own sense of who I am and find a sense of security in this world. But you look at our history, and you look at like the way that people used to deal with trauma, or the way that people used to parent, or all of these things. We're all just almost always in fight or flight, it seems like.
Yep.
And we don't have the language or the skills to be able to interrogate that and carve out space in our own feelings for rational thought. Sorry, long rant for a short question.
I think you very helpfully laid out the the structural but also the personal malaise of our time. And I think it explains the reason why things have become so polarized and volatile at all of those levels, but also explains why there are increasingly people who are turning to sort of lowercase a authoritarianism or uppercase a authoritarianism because, as my one friend put it last week, totally different conversation, but he just said something that resonated with me, is that nobody likes disruptions to programming. And so if you combine all of the things that you laid out there with this expectation that we shouldn't have one person in our community who's living outside, right? We shouldn't have them using drugs in broad daylight. Like that's a disruption to the programming, and you can look at that person and blame them and say they're not from here, and you can dehumanize them, or you can view them as like a glitch in a system that was intended well in a lot of cases. Sometimes systems are, created by people who are self-interested, but you look at them as like not even just a bug in the system. I take it back. They're not a bug, they're a feature of it.
Yeah.
And so what if we considered every person or idea that was a disruption to programming as we like it, if we just considered them as a person with a story, that person in that story helps us get a little bit more of an understanding of this common predicament that we're in, then maybe we won't view them as an enemy, and maybe we won't be so quick to turn to that populist move and turn to violence in order to eliminate any disruption to programming. But that's really hard to do when you're in that hypervigilant state, right? You're in that insecure state. So like it takes time, it takes awareness, and it takes therapy, which I have also done too, to like get to that point of like, oh, I have emotional affective reactions. These are what they are, and here's what's a healthy way to do with them. But I don't, unless you're doing that and developing those resources and you have the time and resources to do it, it's like we are not getting what we need in order to be healthy ourselves and therefore conduct ourselves like within the public and political sphere. Like
Yeah.
we just so no, it wasn't a rant. I thought it was a very like fulsome account of basically like, well, we could, put in the work and reorder our desires and develop the skills that we need to, you know, um, repair something that's really fragile, which is democracy. Um, or we could just, you know, send the people away that we don't like, or build
Yeah.
walls that keeps them out, or throw them in prison, or, just kill them. Like,
Yeah. I
I'm
mean,
sorry, I'm laughing, but this is one of Lowell's first
yeah.
articles is the title says it all is fascism, son of liberalism. That
Hmm.
this is the inherent risk within liberal democracy is that especially when those who play the identity politics game, like, we're here for you. We're interested in the common working person. Like, if you vote for us, we'll get your back. And then, when the political class is voted in and every chance they get to make structural changes in interest of the working class folks, they don't. And then
Yeah.
everybody's like, why are all these working classes voting for like fascist ideologues? They're like, they're mad. They're
Yeah.
mad because you told them that you were going to look out for them, and the moment that you got a chance to, you didn't.
Yeah.
So they're going to vote for somebody who's promising to fix the system, drain the swamp, break it down, and build it up anew. Like
Yeah.
that's that's the inherent risk with democracy, is that if we don't actually view it as a very fragile thing that's liable to self-interest and
Mhm.
toxicity and all these sorts of things, then it's not too many steps away from the types of really volatile politics and just authoritarian impulses that a lot of people are tapping into.
I mean, I think you're bang on, and I think that it's important for people to note that politics and religion are the same thing. We tend to say we've got to keep them separate, but they are both slightly different variations on how we talk about and live out and embody and reinforce our values in public. That's all they are. Religion is a little bit more private in that we tend to not include the family so much in politics. Politics is more about the public square, whereas religion can be in smaller communities kind of thing. But they're both just about how do we embody our values. And so when you look at things like that about like the affect of populism leading to fascism because people were not upholding the vision that they actually had. I mean, we started off this conversation talking about how the church wasn't being very churchy. Um, it's the same thing happening everywhere, and politicians will proof text their ideologies just as much as anyone will proof text the Bible. You look at, I mean, it's always easy to pick on the Americans. Apologies to Americans, but you look at the American right wing, and they really do uphold, Christian nationalists uphold the Constitution as a sacred text. But um, the Second Amendment is in red letters, and the rest of it, all those things about due process and equal rights and things like that, not so much.
Hmm.
And so, every politician might claim an ideology, just like every preacher might claim Jesus, but plenty of them in both camps will offer you health and wealth instead.
Hmm. And what are people willing to give up about who they are and what they believe in order to get that?
Yeah.
Apparently, a lot. I do want to ask. So I want to before we get to like tell me about a day in the life of Jeff. I do want to ask. So you deployed a critique of the more conservative side or right leaning side. You and I obviously are more on the left side.
Mhm.
You know, but I also at times feel a little bit aimless and homeless there as well. And maybe I'm projecting, but I'd love to hear your perspective on like what is getting in the way of some of the things that we're talking about if you're approaching it more from a like a left perspective, or how are we getting in the way of ourselves? Because I do think that there are things that we're doing. And I just say the universal we because I'm like, this is why I'm exploring personalism as an option because I'm like, in real time, I'm exploring it because I'm like, a lot of the things that are offering today, none of them really fit.
Yeah.
And so there may be certain things that I align with on the left and don't at all, but I would be interested in hearing your take on like, how can we help ourselves out a little bit here?
Yeah, I mean, somebody once told me that the left eats their own, and I
Hmm.
later learned that that's a very common phrase for a good reason. Um, the, we are all subject to in-group bias. This is where sociology comes in. Um, it's very easy to point to, say, evangelicals and say, oh, yeah, there's an in-group bias there because they're all about looking inward and inviting people in, but it's all about being in. Are you in or are you out? We even talk about our salvation that way. And then we think that those godless leftists don't do that, but they absolutely do that. The left tends to do it with language games instead. So for 4 years, I was the international affairs critic for the Green Party of Canada. And every day there, I was hearing from two different factions within the party. We somehow had managed to attract robust factions of Zionists and anti-Zionists to the same party. And as international affairs critic, I got to hear from both of them. Um, and
Did you develop an ulcer?
I developed a whole lot more than that actually. When
I'm
the Green
sorry.
Party it went through a bit of a tough time. There was a change of leaders, and then there was a lot of identity politics around that, and the party kind of imploded a little bit. And I I went through a period where I felt like I'd lost many points of IQ. I couldn't finish reading a sentence even. Like I would try and pick up a book to read, and I'd get two sentences in, and I'd need a nap. And that lasted a couple years. And thank God for me, there was a global pandemic going on, and so I got to just keep my head down for 2 years.
Wow.
But I say that too glibly because obviously the pandemic was a massive tragedy, but it worked really well for my family who got to turtle and recover from the existential um, trauma that I had gone through in spending that time in politics and feeling more and more and more disempowered. And so anyway, but during that time, I was hearing constantly from people who, you could issue a statement that was directly to the point about whatever was going on in Israel and Gaza at that time, that was hopeful and inclusive, but also condemning abuses, that was rooted in international law and human rights and all of these things. But if it didn't use the word apartheid, oh boy, watch out, because the pitchforks were coming from within your own party.
Hmm.
Um, because of the language choice. It was entirely about that. And since then, I've learned, of course, about the way that we use language to indicate who our in-group is, and that's where orthodoxies come from and stuff like that. We will make a big deal out of small distinctions and end up with 39 flavors of Baptist. And the same is true on the left. So that is why the left keeps tripping over itself,
Hmm.
because we would rather all die on the first hill we come to,
Yeah.
than accept anything that is impure in our own intentions or our own camp.
Yeah. Yeah. I observe that um in two ways. I'll start from the personal example. Like, you're right in terms of the overlap, because as a theologian who works in academia, when I came out of my PhD, one of my friends put it really right, and colleagues put it right. When you finish your PhD, everything's important. And so, language and this and that, you got to know this, you got to know that, and can't people see this is important? And then I just realized, is like, I need to do some translation work here. Like, internally, in certain contexts, it's good and right to parse terms and make sure that we understand each other. We make sure that we're establishing terms and practices with precision. Um, but that also can get to a point where it becomes a blood sport. And what's really the point of that, other than just to prove that you're smarter and better than other people, which is dumb if you're in
Yeah.
theology. Like, Philippians 2, anyone anyway. But externally, it doesn't help either. If the goal is to connect with people
Mhm.
and help precipitate engagement and learning and collaboration, if I'm not speaking in a way that is intelligible to the people that I want to perceive what I'm bringing to the table as value, like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
Right. So that's why I think it's so valuable, actually, having connections with people who are in local churches and stuff, and taking their concerns seriously, of like, why is it that then when they go out for lunch, to go back to what you're saying, is like, they'd rather talk about golf and the rims they're getting on their car, as compared to what such and such theologian said about this, and the controversy it sparked, and who was right and who was wrong. Like, why is it? And I can see those things as separate, or as I can see those things as related somehow, but
Mhm.
actually doing the serious thinking to bring those two realities into contact and speak meaningful, to be like, here's how this thing that you think doesn't matter actually does matter, for when you're at the bedside of somebody who's about to die, and they're asking, pastor, what do I do about this? Like, this happened years ago, and I need to talk to somebody before I pass over. In the same way, politically, like, I do observe this a lot, when it's like, I have done enough reading to understand, like, what a progressive politician means when they're like, we really need to address the eco injustice, intersectional, whatever, gender. And you're like, I get it, and I totally agree with what you're saying, but you lost them. The moment that
Yeah.
you started that sentence, is like, the average person, like,
Yeah.
I don't know what they're talking about, and they're weird. And I'm not saying in a condescending way that, oh, people are dumb and they just need to, like, read a book. I'm not saying that. I'm
Totally.
saying the average person, unless they've put in the time and the work and spent, like, they don't know what that means. They just
Right.
don't. And that's
And
okay. So
it,
take
it
the
really
time to
is.
translate, right?
It really is just a signal to who's in the in group and who's in the out group. And we're
Exactly.
also susceptible to that. But this is where moral foundation theory is so helpful. Are you familiar
Mm.
with Jonathan Haidt and moral foundation theory?
A little bit, but unpack it for me and
Okay.
for those who aren't well versed.
So, 20, I want to say 2012, The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion came out.
Right. Yeah.
Uh, people might have seen him on the circuit lately for his latest book, which is called The Anxious Generation, all
Right.
about how cell phones have ruined our brains. But
Yeah.
and that's a whole other thing. But in The Righteous Mind, he talks about moral foundation theory. And the basic premise is that we feel like we make a careful, thought out moral judgment. We think that we have values and we have morals. And when we see a moral injustice, or a violation of some moral value we have, that this comes from the careful thought thinking that we've done. But the reality is that we make judgments pre-rationally. We make a knee-jerk reaction to whatever we've just seen, and then our cognitive brain rationalizes that and comes up with reasons why we're right about that. And
Mm.
they study this and prove this in a number of different ways, working with people in behavioral sciences. But they came up with a bunch of different categories for these moral foundations. And everyone feels each of these or is triggered by each of these a little bit differently to different degrees. So, for example, care versus harm. We all love to see a cute puppy and we just want to snuggle it. But if somebody kicks that puppy, we go John Wick, right? Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but then there are others. There's fairness versus unfairness. There's
Right.
loyalty versus betrayal. There's sanctity versus degradation. Um, what's another one? I can never remember all of them at once. Authority is one as well. And the gist is that people who self-identify as liberals or leftists tend to really value care and harm on one hand and fairness on those two are elevated for people who self-identify as being on the left side of the spectrum. People who self-identify as being on the right side of the spectrum tend to care about all of them a little bit less, but equally. So people who are really, really fired up about unfairness tend to be on the left side. And they'll put that we need to take care of people and everything needs to be fair goes to 11.
Mm.
And people who consider themselves conservative are less concerned about that, but they're equally concerned about purity as like a if there's something that is impure or authority, they tend to support the authority of the state or the military or something like that. And so this discrepancy between people who self-identify as left and right really leaves us open to dog whistles. A dog whistle is what we call it when there's a political message that speaks really well to one group of people and the other group of people cannot hear it. Just like if you were to blow a literal dog whistle, I wouldn't be able to hear it, but a dog would get very upset.
Hmm.
So it's not a pejorative term. It's talking about how you can't hear something. But the idea there is that it is very easy for a politician to lace their words with dog whistles, things that are intended to trigger a particular audience. And you look at, say, a conservative Christian group, not only do they have more buttons to push in terms of their moral foundations to which they will react than liberals do, but they also are part of a religious institution that is actively building up those moral foundations as their explicit values for their community.
Hmm.
And so, if you want to speak to any particular political group, the easiest one to speak to in ways that will get them very riled up is conservative Christians because they have more of those buttons to push, and they have an active community that will continue to push those buttons because they're building up those values sets. Um, but what that means for people on the left is that if all they care about is fairness and justice and care, um, they tend to sort of hyper focus on different aspects of that rather than having that broader set of values.
Mm.
And so, it might be that everyone on the left does care about fairness, but then they have the oppression Olympics where they have to debate over who's more oppressed than the other group, and treat trauma like it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think about I've talked about it before in probably in the conversations about like trauma and theology and so forth. But one of the things that I've realized, like we talked about this insecure, hypervigilant state, like, and we talked about, like 20th century evangelicalism. I'm like, we were primed for this type of trigger term, dog whistling term, because that's what preceded the altar call,
Yeah,
right? So no, like right play scaring people into heaven by the idea that because you are a terrible sinner who can't do anything right, you need to repent now to get into heaven, and here's your chance. Like,
yeah,
and the affective power of that, the mobilizing power of it, I think that speaks to what you're saying about here we are now, where it's like that's just expanded into the political sphere, and we're constantly being called not to the altar of God, of course, but like to the altar of mammon or and
yeah,
state, right? But it's like, but the methods are very similar, and like the research is done to like leverage those triggering terms. And that I think this is what I find so compelling about personalism again, is it's like it's putting the person back at the center of this, to say that you may be more concerned about purity or authority or fairness or justice or or care, but the moment that you're willing to dehumanize a person in order to prioritize that value, yeah, that you turn a person in a means to that end, that is the ultimate stress test to me,
yeah,
is what are you willing to do and who are you willing to harm in order to fulfill this ideal that you're holding on to. And there are a lot of people who are like, yeah, totally fine, they aren't human, they are the enemy, right? And they just blow over them. But like, this is where I think the a possible constructive way forward is, what if the thing was, okay, I hold this very dear and I am mad right now, but keeping in view the person
yeah,
and keeping in view what's going on for them, which is they're reacting for different reasons, but we're having that basic primal reaction together. How do I keep in view this person? And if you're a Christian, how do I keep in view that this person too is a bearer of the image of God? Full stop. And we may image imperfectly, yes. However, they are as much a creation of God, a unique creation of God, as I am. And
yeah,
I don't view them as an enemy. I actually view them as my neighbor. And I view
yeah.
them as a neighbor who I'm called to love. And I view them as a neighbor who, as I love them, I may discover they actually might be a friend of mine. And then, right, then the politics, the good politics is the fruit of that. And my curiosity for you is like, can you describe like an average week in the life? Like how does this work out at the local level as you're trying to live this out? Like there's
Sure.
probably what everybody's envisioning with you, being in council and local politics, but how does this work out in two scenarios? One in an average day,
Yeah,
but then maybe in like an extraordinary day. Like what
sure.
is it? What is an average day for Jeff, Counselor Jeff? What are you doing? And what's an extraordinary, like, wow, didn't see that coming, and now we got to think on our feet? Because I
Yeah,
think just even in you describing that will give us a sense of what you're doing, how everything we're talking about informs your work, but also like gives us some constructive resources to sort of live this out in our own context. I mean, we're not all counselors, but like just apply this to the social political landscape we find ourselves in, which is pretty divided and volatile sometimes.
sure.
Often.
Well, I mean, I'll start by saying that it's incredibly boring. It is completely banal. Um, and that's maybe why evil is so banal, but we'll get into that maybe later. But the gist of it is that almost every decision that we make is so thoroughly bounded by the structures of the municipalities don't exist in the Constitution except as a creature of the province. The province gets to set our entire framework. And so there is a municipal act in every province that determines the powers that municipalities have. And then there's a planning act which determines how we decide how land gets used and how cities grow and things like that. And there's all of these levels of legislation and regulation. So by the time it gets down to a decision that we're making as a council, uh, we are so bounded. We don't have any sort of absolute power. We get to decide, yes, this thing will be. Everything that we do is within a framework that's within a framework that's within a framework. And so navigating those systems and understanding how they work together is 90% of my job. Um, and then explaining that to people who cannot believe that council just did that thing. And people will often say things like, oh, council's ramming this through. And it's like, well, actually, our procedure is determined by bylaw, and that's within this realm of the municipal act. And we didn't ram anything through because we don't have the ability to do that. But this is how it happened. And yes, it did go through over your objections because your objections were not considered valid under the Planning Act legislation and regulations. And if we were to take your view into account, then this would be challenged in an appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal, and we would lose it. And this is the way that that system works. And so this is why we decided what we did. And that's more than most people want to sit through. And so not
Mhm.
that many people show up to meetings, and we end up making sometimes very consequential decisions without really any public oversight. And then, of course, we hear about how there's no public oversight and council's just doing its own thing. And it's like, well, nobody came.
It's like the local politics version of office hours when you're
Yeah,
like, I need more FaceTime with my teacher, and you're like, here's when I'm free.
yeah,
You're like, I'll be on Zoom from this point to this point,
yeah,
drop in, ask anything, and then they don't show up. But then you get on your course feedback, they're not available. You're like,
yeah,
I
yes.
literally created space for you to do this. Just like I've
Yeah.
done my part. Can you do yours? You
And
know?
now imagine that your syllabus is 10,000 pages, all written by
Oh,
computers.
man. Yeah.
So that's the sort of everyday, and that's why we have all of these structures for public oversight and for statutory public meetings where people can see what we want or see what we're up to, and they can do a freedom of information request to look at our emails and all of those things because it's important that we have oversight. It's important that,
Accountability,
yeah,
right?
that
If it's
accountability
not
really.
like proactive, there at least people know that there's accountability structures.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are all sorts of flaws in those structures as well.
Hmm.
It could be so much better in so many ways. But when it gets really contentious, I mean, sometimes it gets contentious over stuff that's just straight up made up. Like one time we had somebody request that we look into the protected status of mute swans because they are an invasive species. They are the Queen's birds. They were brought over by British people.
And
Uh,
they look beautiful, but they are fierce.
They are
Living in the
fierce,
UK.
but
Yeah.
also they also produce about 5 pounds of poop every day.
Yeah.
And we have some of the last remaining pristine marshes in Ontario, along Lake Ontario. And so biologists are calling us up, being like, "Hey, can you do something about the swans?" And we say, "The Queen really likes her swans. Queen's dead, but her swans are still her swans." So they are federally protected. And so we sent out a letter asking the province and the feds, "Hey, can you do anything about these swans?" And this was reported in the news as council has unanimously voted for a cull. And so I spent most of last
I'm
year
sorry.
getting.
I shouldn't be laughing, but it sounds like an episode of Parks and Rec, but like Canadian version.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so I spent most of last year getting just anguished emails and
Oh no.
handwritten letters from
Why do
residents.
you hate the birds, Jeff?
Yeah, I
Why do you
had
hate the swans?
I had blood on my hands, Michael. Um,
Swan blood.
yeah,
Not
and
not swine blood, swan blood.
and we
There's a
got
ballet named after the swans.
and there were so many people who came out to a meeting to oppose our supposed cull of the swans that they had to take shifts sitting down in the council chambers because there wasn't room for them.
Oh.
Um, and so I love to see people organize around a thing. But when I walk into a shop in my own town and there's a petition on the counter denouncing council, and it's got names written on it of people that I know, um, and it none of it was ever true in the first place. Like, so sometimes it gets wild like that. But much more seriously, I'm gonna go
Jeff
to
Swan Hater Wheeldon. That that's your nickname from now on.
yeah.
Yeah.
But on a much more serious note, this systems navigation really leads to some of the more serious problems as well. So, before I was even on council, I once brought a delegation to county council. Now, people need to understand that in Ontario, there are two tiers of municipalities, upper tier and lower tier. The upper tier in a rural area is called a county. So we have Brighton government, and then there's Northumberland County. Um, and the upper tier is responsible for things like social services. The province has made them responsible for that. Province largely pays for that. But what that means when we're talking about homelessness is that um, the lower tier and the province can both say, well, that's the county's job. And so there is a significant budget, millions of dollars that go into social services in Northumberland County. And that includes things like rent supports for people who can't afford the rent, which is a lot of people these days. And there's not enough units. They own some public housing. And there's a 10-year wait list in Coburg, 6-year wait in Brighton to get into public housing. Um, and there's one shelter for all of Northumberland. And I used to be on the board of that shelter. Um, and I was watching the way that the different levels of government interacted over this issue of homelessness. In the town of Coburg, this was last term before I was elected, some councillors brought forward the idea that, hey, maybe let's suspend the part of our bylaws that say that we will evict people who are camping in the park. If somebody is camping in the park, what ends up happening is that the bylaw officer comes by and says, you can't camp here. And if there's nobody there, then they just pack up their tents and take all their stuff away. And then the people come back and all their stuff is gone. And they still have nowhere to live. And so they find a different spot in the park and someone else gives them a tent and they start all over again. And bylaw basically just chases them around. Every week they get moved out somewhere else. And so the counselors at that time said, well, can we stop enforcing this? Can we just let people shelter in peace? And there was a big backlash against that from a lot of residents. But then there was also the staff brought back a report that said, well, because of things like insurance and liability, we would need to bring in another fire marshal because there's like one time somebody burned down a tent with a hot pot. And now, there's this idea that anytime somebody who's living rough has a tent and they're camping in the park, that it's a fire hazard. And so they estimated it would cost $400,000 a year extra to not enforce the bylaw.
Wow.
And so at that point, they said, okay, well, then we'll take our idea to county. County, can you, we just want to tell you that we're ready to work with you to do more to support homelessness because the impacts of homelessness were being felt at the lower tier municipal level where, it's people on the street who are witnessing homelessness and feeling upset or feeling concerned, want to help, or maybe want it out of their sight. It's impacting local businesses. It's being used or addressed through by law enforcement. Policing is paid for by lower tier
Hmm.
municipalities. And so there's all of these costs accruing at the lower tier level for something that's supposed to be the responsibility of the upper tier. Meanwhile, it's the province who has decided who's supposed to do what and where most of the money comes from. And so I brought a delegation to county council following Coburg and said, these arbitrary jurisdictional divisions that we've created here. That's what one thing about systems is that any boundaries you ever put on a system are arbitrary. All systems are interrelated to each other. You can never say, oh, that's the entirety of the system.
Hmm.
And so when we say, well, there's actually two different levels of municipal government and then provincial government and then a federal government, and then we've got other, the health district includes 3 different municipalities and all these different things. Every time we create one of these arbitrary divisions, we're creating inefficiencies, we're creating gaps, we're creating all of these problems. Actually solving homelessness by just buying people houses would be cheaper than the amount of money we put in at each individual level to try and address it. If we actually added up all the lower tier, upper tier, and provincial costs, because at the upper tier, that's first responders like paramedics are paid for by the upper tier, and that's where all the social services budget is. But then the province is paying for it through the courts, through the hospitals, all of these things. If we added up all of those costs, it'd be way cheaper to just build a house and house somebody and just give them the key and literally say, here's your house forever. That would be cheaper than keeping somebody living on the street and chasing them from one tenting location to another in the park.
Yeah.
And so when I brought that delegation to county council, the answer they gave me was to say next delegation. There was no response. And so I reached out to some of my friends who we all ended up getting elected in the next municipal election and said, like, we've got to do something because this isn't just a Coburg issue. This is an everywhere issue. And we need to be able to get past these divisions between our municipalities and between the lower tier and the upper tier. And there wasn't a structure or function within those structures for actually bridging those gaps. And so we just made one. And so
Right.
we created the Northumberland Intermunicipal Task Force on Housing and Homelessness. And it started with me just bringing a motion to my own council and saying, I want to create this thing. And every other municipality in Northumberland County, so that's 7 lower tiers, and then in the upper tier, all delegated someone to come to this. And I chaired it for the first year, and now we're halfway through the second year. It's being chaired by councillors from Port Hope. And we are bridging these jurisdictional gaps in order to have conversations and educate people. We are having an impact on policy related to both housing and homelessness. We brought together the developers with the municipal planners and the lenders and the realtors, and we had a conversation about why is housing so bloody expensive.
Mm.
Uh, and so that ended up with a report that's now going to be implemented. I hope almost every council in Northumberland has endorsed it. We're still waiting on a couple more. But we're going to see major changes to bylaws in all of our municipalities to help standardize a few things, to help make some things more progressive so that we can get more houses built and
Mm.
maybe tiny homes and maybe other solutions that we're currently not building any of. And we still got lots of things we need to do about like asking lenders, why won't you fund affordable housing? Why is
Yeah.
it so much harder to get a loan for a tiny home than it is for a mansion?
Hmm.
Things like that, questions like that, that are inherently systems problems that have nothing to do with the practicality of solving these problems. So, you know, when on my normal days, I am completely bounded by systems and structures that almost nobody knows exist and few know how to navigate. And on my extraordinary days, I go outside of all of those boxes and just do something to change the nature of the problem and try and tackle it from a new angle.
That's beautiful. Because sometimes, no, I really mean that, right? I mean, we inherit structures that are flawed, and we have to work with what we get. But sometimes we need to go outside of them to get the solutions that we need because the structures themselves aren't working. And I
Yeah,
think the sorts of thinking that you're doing, the reading that you're doing, the work that you're doing, the focus on the person and understanding what motivates people, helps you figure out what to do and when,
yeah,
right? And how to live with the reality of like some people will continue to think that you don't like swans and you can't convince them otherwise,
yeah,
right? Some people will continue to think that you're not doing enough or you're not doing it in the right way. You're just doing it for yourself. And hopefully your record speaks for itself. But no matter what, you're going to continue to try and do the creative thinking and work that's needed both in and outside the structures that we inherit. I mean, I think that's the most that anybody can do, Christian or
mhm.
otherwise. And I just want to say thank you, Jeff, for defying all of the stereotypes that a lot of people have about politicians today. And I think that's just been the gift of having you on here is to hear everything that goes into what you're doing and just the witness that it is to people to be like, politicians like Jeff exist and they can identify as Christian and they also don't check all of the boxes that make us shudder when we hear the word Christian and politics mixed together. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I want to say that if there's any takeaway here, it's love your enemies, and politicians are just people like everyone else.
Hmm.
I've met so many politicians. We tend to put them on pedestals, but they're just like you and me. And
Hmm.
there are so many people who say, "Oh, I could never do that." And I say, I've met a lot of politicians that you are so much smarter than. Please do it. Politics is something that we all engage with, whether we think we're engaging or not. And so do it with some forethought and some proactivity, and you can change the world because otherwise it's left to just whoever shows up. And whoever
Hmm.
shows up typically are not the people who need to be there. So
Hmm.
please, everyone, love your enemies and run for office.
Mm. Okay. Well, and if people want to know how to do that, are you open to having a conversation with them?
Absolutely, I would love that. You can find me, my municipal email address is jwheeldon@brighton.ca.
Okay.
That's JWHEELDON @brighton.ca. I do blog at jeffwheeldon.ca. I blog on municipal matters. My old theology blog was called Stumbling Through Theology. I haven't blogged there in many years, but I
Hmm.
keep thinking I should. It gets way more hits than my political blog ever does. So
Okay. And where else are you on social media?
I am not, and I'm a healthy person because of it.
Probably good, especially if
Yeah.
you're in politics, although it feels like it's kind of like the expectation is that you'd be on there, but you're countercultural, right? You're just you're breaking the mold,
Well, I used to be the administrator of all the local Facebook groups. Well, the
right?
one local Facebook group that everyone goes to and everyone complains on.
Mm,
And like I said, I went through that period where I was just very broken. And
yeah,
the only way that I could get out of it was to cut down all of my online engagement and
yeah,
refocus on the things like the painting minis, doing that very grounding work of just being present with people and with things that I love. And I couldn't do that as long as I was on Facebook. So
yeah. I hear that. I have my own version of this, where I was heavily, heavily involved in social. I was working in communications for a large church, and I just burnt out,
yeah,
and I was just totally off social media um, for a long time. Like while I was doing my doctorate, which was like 4 years, and then 5.5 years into my role here, I was just pretty much absent. And more recently, I've felt prompted to re-enter to do what I'm doing here,
yeah,
um, because I mean, part of it's my job as a
yeah.
faculty member and lifelong learning, but also just feeling prompted to create a space for conversations like these, so that hopefully people feel less alone, and we think both within and outside the limited systems we're dealing with. But I hear what you say, and I have my own version of that.
Yeah.
And even re-entering, I do it with fear and trembling, because it can be a pit that is just like you never feel that pit.
Well, I
Um,
think they're the perfect example of powers and principalities, which
yeah.
are supposed to be good and supposed to be for our benefit and demand
Hmm.
everything from us.
Yeah. Yep. Well, and Alul and Charbonneau said, the work that they're doing to sort of stall the machine and replace it with something better is like putting little grains of sand in the gears,
Yeah.
just one by one until the gears seize, and then something better hopefully comes on the other side. And we're all just putting grains of sand in one way or another. You're doing it in your way, I'm doing it in mine, and it's just really a gift to talk to people who are doing similar work. So thanks for your time, Jeff. Really appreciate
Well,
it.
thank you. I really appreciate it. I love what you're doing, and I love you. Take care, man.
Oh, love you too, man. It's so great. Look at us now. Hey, who would have thought?
Who
Who would
would
have
have
thought?
thought? 1, 2, 3 on Mikey.